In 530 AD, on a bone-dry plain on the edge of the known world, two empires were about to collide, and 72 hours of carnage would change the Mediterranean forever. Ur was Rome's easternmost fortress, built in a decade, designed to be impregnable. And now the only thing standing between the Sassanid Persian Empire and Byzantine Mesopotamia, the Sassanid army that marched toward Dara in the summer of 530 was the most powerful military force in Asia, 40,000 soldiers who had never been defeated by the armies of Byzantium. Belisarius was 25 years old and outnumbered 2-1, and he had spent weeks designing a battlefield that would turn those odds into an advantage. For days before the Sassanids arrived, Belisarius's men dug not to hide, but to create the tactical geometry that would channel 20,000 Persian soldiers into kill zones of his own design. The trench system Belisarius designed was a trap, a central barrier that would stop the Sassanid charge, with flanking channels that would funnel cavalry into enclosed spaces where numbers became a disadvantage. The Sassanid cataphract was the tank of the ancient world, horse and rider both armored in iron scales, a charging mass of metal that had broken every infantry line it had ever encountered. 20,000 Byzantine soldiers moved into position before dawn, and every man understood that Belisarius's trench design was the only reason they had a chance of surviving the day. Between the two armies, a mile of desert that would, within hours, be covered in blood. Broken shields, and the bodies of thousands of men from two of history's greatest civilizations. Firuz, the Sassanid commander, looked at Belisarius's trench line and saw an obstacle. He did not see the trap, because no one had ever built a battlefield like this before. The Sassanid advance began at dawn on the first day. 40,000 soldiers moving across the desert toward 20,000 Byzantines who had spent 3 days preparing their deaths. Belisarius opened with archery massed volleys from positions elevated behind the trench line, the arrows dropping into Persian formations before the cataphracts could reach the Byzantine infantry. When the Persian front ranks hit the main trench, momentum became a weapon against them. Thousands of men pressing from behind, pushing the lead elements into the excavation they couldn't see until it was too late. At the trench edge, Byzantine infantry held the defensive position. Every Persian who crossed was met by spear points at distance of inches, the shield wall converting Persian numerical advantage into a line that could be held man-to-man. The Sassanid cavalry tried to flank, and found the flanking trenches that turned their charge inward, their momentum carrying them into enclosed channels where cataphract armor became a disadvantage rather than an advantage. Belisarius had positioned Hunnish horse archers on his extreme flanks, and as the Sassanid cavalry funneled into his channels, the Huns rode rings around them, pouring arrows into ironclad men who couldn't turn their horses to face their attackers. When a cataphract's horse went down in the desert dust, the rider's armor protection in motion became a death sentence in stillness, the iron scales pinning him to the ground while lighter infantry moved in. By the first hour, Belisarius's design was working exactly as planned, and the Sassanid army that had never lost a major battle was losing control of a battlefield for the first time in living memory. Shield wall combat at 30 degrees Celsius is not heroic. It is exhausting, dehydrating, and sustained by training and discipline rather than by courage or passion. The Sassanid command structure was sophisticated, but it had never fought a commander who had pre-built the battlefield. And adapting to Belisarius's geometry in real time was proving impossible. By midday, the desert itself had joined the battle. Soldiers on both sides were dying of heat exhaustion as much as enemy weapons. Iron armor and 40-degree sun, transforming warriors into slow-cooking men. Belisarius had pre-positioned water supply inside his defensive lines, understanding that logistics was as much a weapon as the trench system, and that an army that could drink and fight was already halfway to victory. As the sun began its descent on the first day, the Sassanid center withdrew, not defeated, but acknowledging that 40,000 men had failed to break a position held by 20,000, and that a different approach was needed. Night fell on a battlefield where thousands of men lay dead between two armies, and both sides understood that what had happened on the first day was not a battle, but a prologue. The second day began before dawn, and the men preparing to fight could see, in the gray pre-dawn light, the bodies of those who had fought and died in the same positions the day before. Sassanid officers spent the night of the first day in urgent council, redesigning their approach, concentrating force on the flanks where the trench system was weakest, planning to overwhelm rather than outmaneuver. Day 2 opened with a concentrated Sassanid assault on the Byzantine right, a spearhead formation designed to punch through rather than push across. The Persian commanders applying their most powerful unit to the weakest point they had identified. The Byzantine right was under pressure that no defensive position could hold indefinitely, and Belisarius, watching from the center, had anticipated this moment and prepared his response. Belisarius held a personal cavalry reserve throughout the first day and kept it through the night, and on the morning of day 2, committed it at exactly the moment the Byzantine right began to fail. Counterattack hit the Sassanid spearhead in the flank at its moment of maximum extension. Cavalry striking infantry committed to a push forward. Unable to redirect quickly enough to face the new threat, military formation depends on everyone facing the same direction. And when a cavalry force hit the Sassanid spearhead from the side, the formation that had been its strength became a trap. Tightly packed men unable to turn to face their attackers. When formation discipline breaks, battle becomes something more primitive. Individual combat between men who are trying to kill each other before the other man can kill them. And all the tactical genius in the world becomes irrelevant at that scale. Modern archaeology at ancient battle sites reveals what chronicles conceal: the sheer density of broken material, shattered shields, bent spear points, fragments of armor, the physical debris of organized human violence. Ancient battlefield medicine was the practice of doing something in the face of wounds that mostly killed, slowly cleaning wounds that would infect, binding injuries that would not heal, keeping men alive long enough to die from something else. The Sassanid war elephants entered the battle on the second day, armored behemoths carrying archers and spearmen. Their psychological impact on horses and infantry so severe that no ancient army had developed a reliable counter. The Hunnish solution to war elephants was characteristically pragmatic: ignore the elephant, kill the men on its back, and wait for a frightened, uncontrolled 3-ton animal to become a problem for whichever side was nearest. A war elephant in controlled panic was a weapon. A war elephant in uncontrolled panic was a disaster for everyone within reach. And several Sassanid formations on day 2 were broken not by Byzantine weapons, but by their own elephants. Belisarius commanded from the center of his lines, close enough to read the battle directly, far enough to maintain perspective. The balance of information and distance that separated a great commander from a brave one. By the afternoon of the second day, the ground between the lines was archaeology in real time, the accumulation of the dead, and their equipment creating the physical record that historians and archaeologists would eventually begin to piece together. Night fell at the end of the second day, and both commanders understood that the battle had not yet been decided, and that what remained was a question of which army had more left to give. In the darkness before the third dawn, Byzantine engineers repaired the trench damage of the second day, understanding that if the geometric trap failed on day 3, there was nothing else between 40,000 Sassanids and the walls of Dara. Firuz committed everything on the third day, a coordinated assault on all Byzantine positions simultaneously. The tactical doctrine of overwhelming force, betting that the defenders couldn't hold everywhere at once. The third day's pressure was qualitatively different from the first two. The Byzantines were fighting exhausted, fighting on multiple fronts. And the psychological weight of 2 days of sustained combat was a factor that no trench system could account for. On the morning of the third day, the Sassanids achieved what 2 days of fighting had failed to produce: a breach in the Byzantine trench line. And with it, the possibility of unraveling everything Belisarius had built. Belisarius watched the breach develop and made the calculation that separates a great commander from everyone else. Not how to defend the breach, but how to use the Sassanid soldiers who had crossed it as bait for everything that followed. The Sassanid soldiers who had crossed the trench found themselves inside a smaller version of the same. Trapped Belisarius' cavalry hitting them from both flanks, simultaneously. The breach in the Byzantine line becoming a killing field for the men who had forced it. The breakthrough force was destroyed inside the position it had breached, and the annihilation was visible to every Sassanid soldier still outside the trench line. Watching their comrades die in the trap they had believed was a victory, the destruction of the breakthrough force was the psychological turning point. The Sassanid army that had been advancing saw what happened to the men who crossed the trench. The advance began to hesitate for the first time. Belisarius had held his army behind the trenches for almost 3 full days, and when he finally ordered the advance, It hit an army whose psychological confidence had just broken. The timing of the counteroffensive as precise as the original trench design, a withdrawing army that hasn't yet broken into full rout is the most dangerous moment of any battle, and Belisarius advanced with the same discipline that had held the trench line. It's not chasing victory, but harvesting it methodically. The Sassanid withdrawal collapsed into rout somewhere between the 5th and 6th hour of the 3rd day. It's the point where disciplined retreat becomes individual survival. 40,000 soldiers becomes 40,000 separate people trying to escape. Firuz, who had marched 40,000 soldiers to Dara expecting an easy victory, rode from the battlefield in the chaos of his army's rout. The first defeat of his command, reducing the most powerful army in Asia to a fleeing crowd. Victory at Dara looked nothing like the chronicles described. It was exhausted soldiers advancing across a desert covered with broken equipment and fallen men. The aftermath of 72 hours of systematic slaughter. The victorious soldiers of Dara sat down where the pursuit ended, too exhausted to celebrate, too experienced to feel anything immediate. The 72 hours of combat having burned through every emotional resource they possessed. Belisarius rode across the battlefield after the Sassanids had broken, in the face of a commander surveying a victory. He as one carries a weight that the chronicles of his genius rarely describe. From above, the Battle of Dara can be read like a text. The trench lines, the concentration of casualties at the flank channels, the scatter pattern of the Sassanid rout, a 3-day tactical narrative written in blood on a desert plain. The site of Dara still exists in southeastern Turkey, and archaeologists working the ground have found what the chronicles romanticized. The physical evidence of what 72 hours of ancient combat actually produced in bone and metal. Archaeological sites from 6th century battles yield the unglamorous truth of ancient warfare. Broken armor scales, bent arrowheads, spear fragments. Not the gleaming weapons of chronicle illustration, but the battered debris of things used until they failed. Forensic archaeology of ancient battle sites reveals what ancient chronicles conceal. The specific mechanisms of killing, the patterns of injury. The evidence that ancient battles were not heroic affairs, but organized systems of inflicting lethal trauma. The walls of Dara still stand partially in ruins in what is now southeastern Turkey. A UNESCO World Heritage Site that preserves the physical context of the battle that changed Mediterranean history. Procopius of Caesarea was present at Dara as Belisarius' secretary, making him the primary source for the battle's events and the most reliable witness to a tactical revolution that even he struggled to fully describe. The plain south of Dara looks today, much as it did in 530, the same dry air, the same desert heat, the same flat ground where Belisarius arranged his killing geometry and waited for 40,000 Sassanids to walk into it. Military historians have traced a direct lineage from Belisarius' trench geometry at Dara to modern defensive doctrine, the same principles of channeling, flank exposure, and reserve deployment that military academies teach today. The Sassanid court received the news of Dara with disbelief. 40,000 soldiers had failed to break 20,000. And the psychological impact of that failure reverberated through Persian military planning for a generation. Dara changed the strategic balance of the Eastern Mediterranean for the next century. Byzantine diplomatic power increased immediately. Sassanid expansion was checked. And the frontier stabilized in ways that Justinian's subsequent campaigns would depend on. Dara was the first chapter in a military career that would see Belisarius reconquer North Africa from the Vandals, most of Italy from the Ostrogoths, and parts of Spain from the Visigoths, the most remarkable string of campaigns since Julius Caesar. The burial of the dead after Dara, combined casualties from both sides, potentially in the thousands, was itself a logistical operation that took days and required the same organized discipline as the battle that produced them. What made Belisarius genuinely exceptional was not his tactical genius, but his relationship with his soldiers. He led from the front, shared their conditions, and was wounded repeatedly in combat, creating a loyalty that sustained his army through campaigns that lasted years. The defensive innovations at Dara echoed through military history. Commanders from medieval fortress builders to First World War engineers applied versions of the same principles, often without knowing they were repeating Belisarius' solutions. The cataphract's defeat at Dara proved something that military history keeps proving, that superior armor and individual fighting capability consistently lose to superior preparation and tactical design. When the news of Dara reached Constantinople, Justinian understood what his young general had achieved. and the political capital of the victory funded the subsequent campaigns that would briefly restore the borders of the old Roman Empire. Belisarius' story ends in the way that history often treats its greatest servants. Justinian eventually arrested him on conspiracy charges, stripped him of his wealth, and though later restored to some dignity, the greatest general of the age died, diminished by the emperor he had made great. The civilization that Belisarius' soldiers were dying to protect built the Hagia Sophia, created the mosaics of Ravenna, and codified the legal system that underlies European law today. The stakes behind the arithmetic of the 72 hours were that high. The Sassanid soldiers who died at Dara came from a civilization as sophisticated and accomplished as Byzantium. And the battle was not between civilization and barbarism, but between two great powers who both believed they had a right to dominate the world they shared. Dara produced a diplomatic result alongside its military one. Sassanid negotiators at subsequent peace talks operated with the memory of 40,000 soldiers failing to break 20,000, and that memory shaped every concession they made. Dara challenges the romantic view of ancient warfare. It was won not by individual heroism but by engineering, logistics, and the systematic application of tactical intelligence to a problem that had a mathematical solution. Behind every tactical innovation, every trench angle, every cavalry reserve, there were individual men who wrote letters home and prayed and carried small objects that reminded them of who they were when they weren't soldiers. Stand on the plain south of Dara on a clear night. The stars you see are the same stars that lit the aftermath of 72 hours of systematic ancient slaughter. The ground below you still holding the evidence of what happened there in 530 AD. The most powerful weapon at Dara was not a cataphract's lance or a Hunnish bow. It was a set of trenches dug by exhausted soldiers in the desert days before the battle. The physical expression of a 25-year-old's tactical genius. The soil of Dara still holds the chemistry of what happened there in 530, and the question it leaves us is this. If one 25-year-old commander could change the history of two empires by designing a battlefield, what does your generation's version of that problem look like? And who is designing the solution? Tell us in the comments.